Standing on the very edge of the building in front of a fearsome man, the protagonist reflected on the fact that earlier she had even had her gas cut off. And today, the electricity had been cut off for non-payment. Then the man turned to her and asked why the girl was running away when he asked her for money, but she fearfully retreated further and said that she really didn't have any, as she only had 20,000 won left. 0001, and she has to stretch it out for 2 weeks until her part-time job pays out. But the man, unhappily approaching and disdainfully looking at the protagonist, shouts and asks why the girl is running away if she has no money, then ordered her to stop lying and give all her money nicely. The protagonist, looking at him uncertainly, realized that if now she gives all her money tomorrow, she will not even have something to eat. But suddenly that man, to her horror, swung to hit her, and then the protagonist screamed in panic that she really had nothing to give him. But the next moment, to the protagonist's horror, as she tried to dodge the blow, she fell off the roof. And as she was flying down, she cried and didn't realize that she was going to die such a stupid death, all because she couldn't give her last money. She recalled that her whole life was insanely hard, and even her end was terrible because she was from a poor family with a drunken father. And her mother put up with it as best she could for a few years, but then she got divorced and left. The protagonist herself managed to cope and eventually escaped from this tyrant, but alas, and their fatal family connection caught up with the girl. The man had a lot of debts, so he had to take all the money the girl had saved for her college education. But even after that, she didn't give up and worked part-time so that she could survive. But eventually, in the last moments of her life, looking at her father that excitedly looked down where she was falling, the girl thought about the fact that all her actions and everything that she had earned so hard just disappeared into nothing, and it was all connected to her family. She never had a friendly family or affectionate parents like the others. The protagonist thought for a second before she hit the pavement that she didn't need anything else and all she wanted was a quiet life. But suddenly, the next moment, there was a prophecy in her head that a seed had been planted in the east that would save the world. After that, the protagonist, not sure, opened her eyes, did not understand who was addressing her, and whether she was called by a name unknown to her. People who were nearby called her Mabel. After that, looked at the girl, admired her beauty. Then the man who had been looking at her happily turned to the golden-haired girl and said that Mabel seemed to have grown a little since their last meeting, and it had only been a few days. But the lady bowed graciously and informed him that all this was possible only because of his lordship, and the girl was madly glad that His Highness was well. The main character, being in the hands of a handsome and majestic man, thought about hearing some strange voices, and the idea came into her head that she might have been reborn. So she assumed that maybe she was hearing the voices of her parents, who seemed to her insanely soft and caring. But then she thought that even such voices change with time, and worried that her unhappy life might repeat itself. Some time passed, and Mabel, tiredly pulling herself up, began to utter the usual cries of children, which were at once noticed by her nurse, who inquired why the girl was crying, and worried that the princess might be hungry. Taking the girl in her arms, she started to calm her down, and then the main character stated that she was really reborn, especially now she became a princess of a country she had never heard of before. But at first the girl denied it and thought it was just a nickname. But the denial of reality did not last long, because soon she had to recognize what happened to her and that the main character really became a princess. She reflected that having a golden spoon in her mouth was far better than being poor, but the difference from her past life was indeed incredibly great. The protagonist was actually born in the great empire of Hermano, and she was the emperor's second child after her older brother, and her name was Mabel Gardenia Hermano. From the stories of the servants who were always at her side, Mabel realized that her mother had died of ill health shortly after giving birth to her. And usually in such situations, fathers completely forget about their child and consider him a murderer of his wife. So she was madly curious about what the emperor would do. But afterwards, she realized that even if the man did not pay attention to her, it would be even better. But through her sleep, she heard a soft voice calling her by name, and she could only wonder when that soft voice would become so habitually harsh and hateful toward her. Then, still in the arms of her nanny, who told the princess that she was going to put her back to bed so that she could sleep, the protagonist thought about the fact that she did not understand whether this voice was a dream or a reality. Then she thought that it was very hard to be trapped in the body of a child, because no matter what she did, she always wanted to sleep. But suddenly, to the nanny's surprise, the emperor entered the room. The nanny was madly surprised, but he gestured for her to be as quiet as possible. He didn't want to wake the princess. He then walked over and started stroking her little sleeping face, admiring his little daughter. But suddenly, to the emperor's great surprise, at that moment the girl woke up because she was tickled and looked at him with her bright blue eyes. Then he gazed at Mabel joyfully, glad that she was awake, and the heroine herself did not realize who was in front of her, for it was the first time she had seen this man. While she was scrutinizing the man in front of her, he asked her nanny if she thought Mabel was looking at him, but the nanny said with a smile on her face that the princess must have recognized her father and calmed down at once, for not long ago she had been crying, and now she's acting as if it never happened at all. The main character was shocked looking at the young man in front of her. She could not believe that it was really her father. After all, he looked insanely young, and initially she thought that maybe it was her brother. But then he pulled his hand, and the protagonist squinted, expecting something bad, or perhaps a blow, or some rough action in her direction. To her great surprise, the emperor gently stroked her pink hair and then informed her that, as expected, she was able to recognize him and praised her for it. The girl looked closely at his sad face and realized that that was probably her mother's name. Then the emperor bent over the child more cheerfully and smiled brightly at Mabel, telling her that he would never let anyone hurt her. Then he reached out his finger to touch her soft skin. But at that moment, the protagonist reflexively squeezed his finger into her little baby hand. The emperor literally glowed with happiness and embarrassment and said that his daughter was cute, and Mabel grudgingly thought that she hadn't done it on purpose. After all, children reflexively grab everything they touch, and then she thought sadly that she didn't want any love from her family. Even though they treated her as if she were the most important thing in the world, they loved and valued her as if she were a jewel. But inevitably, the moment when everything will change once and for all. So after living such a horrible life, the main character decided that she didn't need any of this, and she decided that she shouldn't expect anything. After all, she just wanted a quiet life, especially since life is all about being alone anyway. On the continent in which Mabel was reborn, there are 3 countries of great power. The largest in area is the Great Empire of Hermano. The second largest is the enemy country of Devlin, and the sacred kingdom of Abelardo that crosses them. And in this kingdom there are no unbelievers. It's inhabited by people who serve God, and they follow his will. So that's what the sacred kingdom of Abelardo has been for centuries. And on the day the protagonist was born, the oracle of the sacred kingdom descended and spoke a prophecy that a seed had been planted in the east that would save the world. And that day, a thunderbolt struck the imperial castle of Hermano, and it was clear to everyone that it was Mabel who was the seed. So the little princess was asked to be sent to the sacred land, and every day they wrote letters to the emperor with this request. But Emperor Esteban Nis Hermano was insanely unhappy about it every time and cursed the sacred kingdom of Abelardo for doing so. Then he thought about the fact that they have the first prince Ascari. The kingdom of Abelardo knows very well that because of his brother Mabel has almost no chance to take the throne, and so they decided to take Mabel to them. But the emperor realized that Mabel was his beautiful daughter who looked so much like his beloved, and this child was precious to him. He resolutely tore the request to shreds. The man indicated that under no circumstances would he accept such an offer. Then, literally crying, his employee Gustav reported that he fully understood the decision of Esteban Nis Hermano, but however had no idea how long they could ignore the request of the kingdom, because they needed a good reason to disengage from their attention. It was Oscar, the protagonist's younger brother, who was listening to the Abelardo kingdom's continued request to give them the princess. But suddenly, unexpectedly for the little boy, the door opened, so he literally flew out and almost fell. Then awkwardly immediately hid behind the door, because he did not want to be seen. But still it did not save him, so his father called him. Then the child looked at the emperor and greeted his majesty with determination. But the emperor looked affectionately at his son and asked why he had come here. It was the first principal of the Urmano Empire, who looked resolutely at his father and asked when he would allow him to come. His Majesty looked at his son seriously and asked what the boy meant and what he wanted. But that maximum seriously, which was so not peculiar to his age, said that he wanted to meet with his sister, on what he received a strong refusal from Esteban Nisvermano. So Oscarin gave up and asked about the reason for this refusal, because earlier the emperor said that he would be able to meet with his sister in a month. But the emperor calmly informed Oscar that he would definitely want to hold Mabel in his arms when he saw her, and that he might accidentally drop her. The emperor did not know what to say, for he had once broken his father's most precious possession. But afterwards he did not give up his idea and looked at his father and said that he had promised to introduce him to his sister. But he looked seriously at his son and said that his refusal was fully justified and that they could not act so unreasonably. When Oscar heard this, he was very upset because he would not be able to meet his sister today, because he had waited so long for her birth month to pass, and he couldn't sleep the night before because of excitement and even tried to finish his fencing class early. The emperor saw Oscar so upset, and with a smile on his face told him that if he wanted to see his sister so badly, it couldn't be helped. Then he thought that Mabel was too young to remember the meeting anyway and told Oscar that he could follow him and he would show him his little sister. The main character at this time was lying in her bed and dying of boredom because being a child was not easy at all, and it is quite understandable why children do not remember infancy. As it is now, the only thing the main character can do is to lie and look at everything around her, and she could do absolutely nothing. Not even to roll over on her other side. She also slept all the time, and so to her even the normal conversation of the people around her seemed like background noise, like a lullaby, which made her want to sleep all the time. In the end, we would still close our eyes and the maids would look at her with pleasure and joy, thinking that the princess should have eaten before going to bed, but had fallen asleep again. But to their surprise, the emperor and Crown Prince Oscar arrived. The protagonist immediately recognized her father's voice and in shock did not understand why he came to her again and admitted to herself that of all the people around her, the emperor worried her the most. But the man leaning over Mabel's crib was madly pleased that the girl had opened her eyes when she heard someone come in. Then he said that his daughter was insanely sweet, and the main character herself thought that she would have been better off pretending to be asleep. But suddenly, from nowhere appeared the face of the little Prince Oscar, who with all the attention looked at the main character, and that shocked looking into his eyes did not understand who this little boy. The servants were madly rejoicing because the princess liked the little prince, but the emperor only grudgingly remarked that Mabel's eyesight was not yet sufficiently developed, so she was not looking at Oscar, so he should not be mistaken. Mabel only thought about the fact that earlier the emperor thought that the girl was looking at him, so such words from him sounded strange. But Oscar didn't listen to his father, and so smiling brightly at Mabel said she was crazy cute and he couldn't take his eyes off her. But the protagonist just mumbled something and then mentally thought she wanted to tell these people to come out, but all she could make were incoherent noises because she had no teeth. But this one literally shone with Oscar Putum that the protagonist had just said brother addressing him. And she looked unhappily into his worried face and thought that she had not said anything like that at all. But at that moment, Esteban Nisvermano laughed and told his son that he was wrong, because most likely Mabel wanted to say daddy. The protagonist, looking at his happy face, literally wanted to scream that both of these people were wrong, and all she was trying to tell them was to shut up and finally leave. Then she looked excitedly at her nanny and mentally asked her to do something about these people who were bothering her. Mabel, seeing the girl so excited, bent over her and suggested that perhaps the princess was hungry, and turning to the maid, asked if the mixture was ready for her. Mabel looked at the nanny excitedly and tried to tell her that she didn't mean it, and that it was all a mistake. Then the nanny, not understanding her message, began to feed her, but Mabel wasn't happy about it and wondered why all these people around her couldn't leave her alone. Then she looked at her brother and wondered if he was going to watch her eat all this time. After which she began to analyze that this boy looks insanely like his father and is most likely the same brother that Madame was told about earlier. While the protagonist was looking at her trying to figure out who he was, the boy shone happily to his father and told him that his little sister was looking at him and was madly happy about something like that. At that moment, the main character decided that she was ready to go to extreme measures, so she took her bottle of formula and began to drink it insanely fast. The nanny, carefully watching the princess, thought that apparently Mabel was really very hungry. But the main character herself only thought that she wanted to eat everything and get rid of attention from her father and brother. Eventually, she stopped halfway through and was unhappy about the fact that when she ate it became hard to breathe, but afterwards realized that it was probably because she had the body of a small child. But suddenly, in the next moment, she was taken in his arms by Esteban Nis Hermano, who smiled happily at his daughter and told her that he wanted to feed her himself. She was literally shocked by this and did not know how to behave. While all the people who were watching this, including the nanny, were very much amused by this behavior on the part of the child, thinking it was insanely cute. They did not realize that at this moment the protagonist was trying her best to escape from their attention, and at this moment was thinking that she did not like it at all and was insanely uncomfortable. But afterwards she couldn't resist and let herself be fed, because her protests made no sense, because she couldn't compete with adults. But after she finished her formula, I thought it was crazy unfair that she had turned into a baby, because she couldn't even say that she didn't like something. At that moment, Esteban Nis Hermano was looking at her excitedly, praising his daughter and saying that she was doing a great job of eating well. She realized that she couldn't do anything about it, so she decided that she should eat as soon as possible so that he would leave her alone. After a while, she finally finished her meal, and then, to Mabel's shock, her father leaned close to her to admire his lovely daughter. She didn't understand how he could be so close to her. In the end, she couldn't help herself, and in the next moment, she belched all the milk she had eaten right onto His Majesty, the Emperor's face. All the servants and Oscar, who was nearby, were madly excited and did not know how to behave, because this had never happened to the princess before. So the nanny approached the emperor and gave him a handkerchief and asked Esteban Nis Hermano if he was all right. He assured them that all was well, then with a bright and determined smile informed them that the milk Mabel had regurgitated was actually holy water. Then with great affection he began to wipe the face of the little girl, who looked at him shocked and did not understand why the man had said such a silly thing and what he meant. He only said that he was madly pleased that Mabel was eating well. Then Mabel, still looking around frightened, she did not understand whether the emperor meant the holy water she had thought of. And did he say that what came out of it was holy water? Then she thought Esteban Nis Hermano madly strange. Then she looked around in horror at the other people in the neighborhood, who apparently thought the same thing. And there was a warm, joyful atmosphere around her. And the girl looked at this and didn't understand whether people around her were normal or not. But then she shifted her gaze to Oscar, who looked rather worried, so the girl thought that he probably noticed this strangeness from other people too. So she hoped that this boy would tell everyone else that they were mistaken. But the one literally glowered at Esteban Nis Hermano and asked if he could hold his little sister in his arms. But looking at his worried face, the emperor simply remained silent, unable to find the right words to refuse his son. Seeing this, he realized at once that he had probably already been refused. Being in the arms of Esteban Nis Hermano, Mabel thought that all she could do was to look from one man to her brother, and that she had absolutely nothing to say or do. But in the end, the visits of the emperor and Oscar only became more frequent, so the protagonist became convinced that God does not exist. After all, she prayed that these people forgot about her existence, not the other way around. After all, she never asked for such increased attention to her person, and even Oscar came to her even without the presence of the emperor, which the girl was madly displeased with. But then she noticed the dangling structure above her and wondered if the shiny pebbles were attracting her attention. Esteban Nis Hermano ordered his servant to get out of the way and then went to the necklace and said that it is important for him to get it for the emotional development of his child. And he wants to take this necklace because it is the most beautiful and visually like his daughter. But his servant literally begged him to stop kneeling and said that he is trying to destroy a family heirloom and it is completely impossible, and then said that such actions are punishable, and therefore if you do not know what you are doing. She thought that she didn't understand the emperor at all, as he was behaving strangely enough that she could probably call him a madman. At this time, a conversation was going on between two servants, and the man told Larimar's maid that the egg of the divine beast had been found in the northern forest and had hatched on Her Highness's birthday. Larimar didn't quite understand what he was talking about, so she asked the man to explain. Then he said that the sacred beast that hatched from the egg looked like a cat and had golden hair. But she was excited. She asked where the guy had heard such nonsense. But the man proudly told Larimar that if she didn't believe it, she could go and ask him herself, since he wouldn't lie to her. But she grudgingly remarked that a cat can't have golden hair, especially naive people don't survive in this world. So he should stop believing such talk. Hearing about something like that made Mabel want to eat a hard-boiled egg, and then she wondered about the divine beast they were talking about, but just sensibly noted that if Larimar's words were to be believed by her maid, it was just a rumor, and then sensibly noted that the arguments between Larimar and Xavier were funny enough to listen to from the sidelines, and thought that when two young people were fighting all the time, they should have fallen in love long ago. But then the protagonist resolutely put her hands up and thought that while Larimar and Xavier were fighting, she could try to do her own thing again, namely training to grow faster. After all, when the servants weren't paying attention to her, she was quietly doing her exercises. So now she could wiggle her fingers and hold the toys more confidently in her hands. So she thought that for today's training, she could choose something more difficult, and something that she could turn herself over on her own. So she began her hard and tedious training, but she never succeeded. And she realized with horror that I was still too small, and she wondered indignantly when she would grow up. She was mad at this fate because she couldn't even walk or talk, but she couldn't even kick her blanket when she was angry. But suddenly her younger brother Oscar knocked in her room, excitedly looking at the girl and wondering if she was awake. But his appearance did not go unnoticed by the nanny, who excitedly informed His Highness that he should not touch the princess with dirty hands. But the nurse excitedly tried to explain to His Highness that he should not come so often, for if the emperor knew about it, he would be reprimanded. But he had already fled without even listening to her warning, so the girl thought that Esteban Nis Hermano probably already knew that his son often came to see his youngest daughter. Then she turned her attention to Mabel, who was sweating from her hard workouts and thinking that no matter how many times she tried, all her attempts had ended badly and she had never been able to get closer to her goal. But this did not go unnoticed by the madam, who excitedly approached and put her hand on her head. Mabel excitedly said that the princess had a cold sweat and most likely she was sick. She tried to explain that she was sweating because of the movement, but of course no one understood her. So the nanny excitedly turned to another maid and told her that Larimar should call a doctor immediately, as Her Highness was all wet and probably sick. And the heroine still tried to explain that everything is absolutely wrong, but no one understood. At this point, Oscar had already arrived, who had just come out of the bathroom and went straight to his sister. But he heard the conversation between the maids and wondered why they needed a healer and why it was so noisy. But then, to his shock, the nanny informed him that she had called a healer for the princess, and so Oscar should have waited a little longer. The boy excitedly ran up to his sister and looked at her and asked her if she was sick, and then, almost crying, asked his sister not to be sick. She tried to explain to him that she was all right, but in the end she only came out with unrelated words. When Oscar heard this, he noticed that the main character had an insanely weak voice. The protagonist was tired of explaining things to people who couldn't understand, so she turned away from them and thought that they could think whatever they wanted. But her brother perceived that she had fainted, so he tearfully turned to Madame, and the latter frightenedly told the prince that they should wait for the physician to examine her as soon as possible. And Mabel was not satisfied. She wondered if anyone in the house could understand her before she died of embarrassment, for every day in this world was a trial to her. Then footsteps sounded outside the door of the protagonist. It was Esteban Nis Hermano, who was walking excitedly to his daughter's room, and Mabel thought that it was likely that such determined steps might be the healer's, so that as soon as he looked at her, everyone would at once be convinced that she was well. Suddenly, to her shock, went the startled emperor, who shockingly approached her and inquired what had happened to Mabel. The protagonist looked worriedly at the hand with which he stroked her face with some unknown trepidation, checking if she was okay. Then the girl thought about the fact that she felt as you are strange, because absolutely does not understand why Esteban Nis Hermano so looks at her, and he looked as if he was afraid that something would happen to her. In the end, a little more time passed and a healer came to them, who said that in fact Her Highness Princess was in good condition, and when she was covered in cold sweat, she was probably just sweating and nothing bad had happened to her. After hearing such words from the healer, the protagonist tried to realize that he was absolutely right, because she was only sweating because of the heat and training. But the emperor was not satisfied with such an answer, so he looked carefully at the healer in front of him and asked why the girl sweated sharply. Because, as you know, the body temperature is stabilized by internal magic. He said that he did not know the reason, but now Mabel does not sweat. Therefore, everything is fine. At that moment, Esteban Nisvermano took Mabel in his arms with all this trepidation and smilingly looked at the little frail child, genuinely glad that his daughter was not sick. While in the emperor's arms, the heroine thought that it was strange to feel something like this because in the arms of this man she did not feel uncomfortable, and it was very unusual. The more so that she felt even a kind of relief next to him. 10 minutes before the incident, the emperor was sitting with all of his close associates, and they were discussing the fact that the wounded soldiers were already feverish, and although they were alive, their wounds were too deep. However, they were very lucky because in the end, they were able to capture Devlin's devil. Devlin's devil was one of the main problems of the Hermano Empire from the enemy country of Devlin. He always wore black without any armor and weapons and single-handedly managed to massacre the troops, and he was the weapon of the country of Devlin. And some dubbed him a ruthless and cruel monster, so they called him the devil, and to no one's great surprise, they never even managed to gather any information about this man. In the end, a bloody massacre took place last month when Devlin's forces invaded the territories of the Hermano Empire. And thanks to this invasion, the warrior Hermano managed to capture it, and all who saw this mysterious demon were shocked. When Esteban Nisvermano thought about it, he immediately asked where the child was found. His informants said that the boy had crossed the border. However, their soldiers managed to catch him, and apparently the child was running away from someone, which seems strange enough. The emperor has ordered the child to be interrogated and the guards to be reinforced and watched closely. But suddenly his servant came up to him and whispered something in his ear, which made Esteban Nisvermano look insanely worried. And the next moment he jumped up excitedly from his seat and inquiring whether he had correctly realized that his precious daughter was ill, then said that he was going to see her at once. All of the remaining people who participated in the discussion of the topic were disturbed by this behavior on the part of the emperor. Then they realized that Mabel was the name of a princess who had recently been born, and apparently His Majesty had been very concerned lately because of Her Highness the Princess. Then one of the gathered people said that they had heard earlier that Mabel had the same hair as the late Empress. She also inherited the same bright sky blue eyes as the emperor, so the girl was insanely cute. But after they excitedly realized that the emperor's little daughter had fallen ill, and they all unanimously decided that this was a terrible event, so this could not be left unattended by her father. They thought so because the feelings of all the subordinates and servants towards the protagonist's mother were very special. Because with the death of Her Majesty the Empress, the emperor had returned to the time when he was once known as the Bloody Emperor, so Mabel was really the only hope of this empire. Finally, some more time passed, and having changed Mabel, the excited maids watched her sleep, and then Larimar asked her nurse if the girl was all right, for Her Highness had been ill earlier in the day, so everyone in the castle seemed madly anxious. Then she mentally turned to the girl who was sleeping peacefully in her crib and asked Her Highness to grow up in good health and also to be protected by the fire of the empire. A little more time passed, and the main character, carefully observing her servants, stated that there are no quiet days in this palace because there are always some new events. Especially in connection with a certain cold weather, the servants began to dress her so that she felt comfortable, which took a lot of effort and patience. So all the servants tried for Mabel's comfort, and the nanny constantly asked Larimar to pack new things that were prepared especially for the main character. And Xavier was responsible for rearranging the princess's room so that her crib stood in the most comfortable place for her, so that the girl would not get sick. So that all the next days, the main character was absolutely not deprived of attention from the servants and from Oscar and the emperor. And on this day, her little brother came in again and smiled at her excitedly and asked her if she was in a good mood. Mabel tried to assure him that she was all right, but in the end, she failed to say anything inaudible. Now the little princess was lying in Oscar's company, wrapped in a warm blanket and dressed in winter clothes, and also wearing a knitted hat which her nanny had recently knitted for her. And she was in a very uncomfortable baby carriage and looked around unhappily, thinking that she would be very glad if all the people around her would just leave her alone and let her sleep in peace. Then she thought about the fact that she had heard from the servants that her stroller was made of the highest quality wood, and she did not understand why she had to spend so much for that. And she thought about the fact that she did not want to go for a walk, because she was very annoyed by all this. But of course, no one understood or heard her. But in the end, before she had time to go outside, the main character was looking around the castle with admiration and marveling at how huge the imperial palace was, because it was really bigger than Mabel had ever imagined. She had always been curious to know what the place where she lived really looked like. The girl looked around and thought that it had been a really good walk. The servants looked at her with a smile and thought that apparently Her Highness had enjoyed the walk and should enjoy it too, especially since it was a warm, sunny day. But afterwards, to the great surprise of the servants, the protagonist began to shake from the cold and tried with all her might to make it clear that she was freezing, because inside the palace it was much warmer, and the temperature had changed abruptly because they had left. Then Oscar excitedly took off his outer clothes and asked if his sister was really cold. Then he carefully covered her with his sweater. As a result, the protagonist was almost completely hidden behind warm clothes, for all the servants had taken off their outer garments to cover her. Mabel grudgingly admitted that she could not see anything at all, and it was silly that she had gone out to look around and had her vision blocked. But suddenly, the emperor came up to them and, looking at this company in amazement, stated that apparently they had gone for a walk. And the main character was madly surprised that she met her father in such a place and wondered why he was walking here. Afterward, he pulled Mabel from a whole pile of sweaters and smiled brightly, looking over his little daughter with maddening joy at the thought that his daughter had decided to scatter a little outside. The servants and even Oscar were surprised that the emperor gave his jacket so easily. His Majesty's clothes were made of magic cloth, and it was so expensive that it was hard to imagine. So it was quite unexpected that the emperor so easily gave his clothes to the little princess. The protagonist looked excitedly at Esteban Nis Hermano and wondered why he had decided to give her such a valuable thing. But afterwards, she mentally admitted that she did feel much warmer. So they went to the northern forest of Hermano, where the servants were excitedly discussing that it was very pleasant to be alone with nature, and even more so on such a beautiful day. And the protagonist was mostly looking at the sky in front of her, which was insanely beautiful and bright blue. And then she thought that as soon as they got here, she caught a boundless blue sky, though the last sky she'd seen in her world had been black as pitch with a couple of glowing stars. But even though what had happened to her had happened only a few months ago, it seemed like a long time ago. But despite this, she had not forgotten about what had happened. Thinking about it, she covered her eyes a little, which did not go unnoticed by her brother, who looked at her sister excitedly and asked if she wanted to sleep. She only grudgingly thought that it was not that at all, and she had just caught some not super pleasant memories from her life. But the next moment, Oscar hugged her tightly and told her that his sweet sister could sleep if she wanted to. He didn't mind at all and promised that he would be there to keep her asleep. Then Mabel only looked at him in surprise and wondered why Oscar liked her so much. Then she remembered what had happened this morning when Oscar ran excitedly into her room. Then her nanny asked the boy if he was supposed to be at practice. The nanny excitedly wiped the boy's face with sweat because he was in such a hurry and said that it was very nice of him to worry about his sister. At this moment, the protagonist's brother smiled brightly and informed the madam that today was the first time May was going out for the first time, so he madly wanted to be by her side at this moment because he was her brother. Then the main character excitedly began to think about it. After all, she never considered the family of the emperor as her own. And perhaps it was due to the fact that she completely accidentally got into this world, and she absolutely did not understand how to behave with these people, because they were complete strangers to her. although for them she was the most native. The main character absolutely could not answer for herself such a simple question as if she would like to be born in such a family. After that, she thought that, in fact, the people in whose family she was born, absolutely nothing to blame for her, and on the contrary try to make her life much better. But suddenly Xavier, who had been removing stones that could be dangerous for the little princess, noticed something and began to look at something ahead with all his attention. Then he was madly surprised and called the others and said that he had seen a divine beast. The protagonist, hearing about it, was madly surprised and could not believe that she could really meet the same divine beast that was born on the same day as herself. Then she remembered Xavier's stories about a mythical beast that looked like a cat, and apparently the boy's words were not an ordinary rumor. Then Mabel thought about the fact that where she lived there were no such beasts before, so she was curious to see something like that for once. But Larimar calmly looked at the man and told him that he should not lie, and said that the young man had been deceived about the existence of such a beast. Oscar hot and did not react in any way, but seemed to be more inclined to Larimar's version, and the protagonist stretched out her small childish hands towards the man and asked him to take her to the creature. Then the prince was addressed by Xavier, who said that if the prince wished he could come to see, and Mabel was shocked to realize that they probably wanted to leave her here with Madame and not even let her see. After the protagonist was in the hands of the nanny, she began to break free and show her younger brother that she wanted to go with him. This did not go unnoticed by her nanny, who smiled and, looking at such a cute girl, asked if Her Highness wants to go with the prince. And there she was, literally mentally begging Oscar to take her with him because she wanted to see the mythical beast too. She was excited. Looking at her brother, she realized she couldn't let him go alone. She wanted to see it so badly. And then, to the shock of everyone else, she loudly said Mio without even realizing it. So she noticed that all the people around her had gone silent and looked so embarrassed that Mabel didn't understand what was causing this reaction. Then excited Oscars immediately remembered how Nanny had told him before that he would have to wait until the girl was 2 years old to be able to pronounce any words. So he excitedly turned to his sister and asked, "Did she just say Mio?" But his guesses were confirmed by the other servants who said that they also heard it. So the main character indignantly repeated and said Mio again. And all the other servants, namely Xavier and Larimar, were insanely shocked by this, because it was absolutely not typical for a child of her age, and they did not know how to react to such a thing. But Mabel thought about the fact that she accidentally said it because she wanted to look at the mythical cat, and they did not want to take it. Then she looked at the worried nanny, who was looking at the child with an attentive and intense gaze, literally unable to find words. Mabel, seeing this expression, which was so uncharacteristic of her nanny, wondered why she had such a reaction and what problems had arisen. But then she excitedly announced that the princess had started talking at 2 months old. Then the girl was literally shocked to realize that she had given up these sounds for nothing, because it was too early for her. But afterwards she began to think about the fact that she didn't realize how she had done it, because it was an insanely impulsive act. And perhaps it was because she had become a child, and her mind had also become like a baby's. Then she thought about the fact that her little body was actually the soul of an adult young jewel. But even so, she was acting insanely impulsive, and perhaps it was all due to the fact that her body hadn't grown. Then she sadly realized that she had been too hasty with her first word. But then she was joyfully picked up by Larimar, who, admiringly looking at the child and hugging her tightly, literally shining with happiness, said that she had always guessed that their princess was a real genius, because she could already say her first words. That only grumbled something displeased. But the maid could not understand the words, so she turned to Her Highness and asked her to repeat them, but the maid only thought that Larimar should not try to interpret everything she said. But then the girl noticed a madly sad Oscar, who said that his sister's first word was cat, not brother, and so he sadly stated that he had lost to some animal. Mabel looked carefully at her puzzled brother and did not understand what was the cause of such an expression, for the boy looked as if he were in great pain, and perhaps such an act had really shocked him. Then the nanny leaned over Oscar and explained that Mabel probably wanted him to hug her. Then the protagonist thought about the fact that after her rebirth, she had never asked to be hugged first because she didn't want to be hugged. But she couldn't see Oscar being heartbroken over something as simple as that, and she didn't want to hurt him more. Thoth happily and gently wrapped his arms around the small child, happy that his little sister wanted to hug him for the first time. But then Mabel mewed in protest and told Oscar that he should take her to the forest as soon as possible. It was shocking enough for them that she was able to say her first word, but they had to go see the mythical beast that had hatched the day she was born. Luckily, her brother realized that the girl wanted to go and see the cat, so he said that they would go to him right away. They went into the forest, and a disgruntled Larimar asked Xavier if he had not deceived them. But the man said he had definitely seen the mythical beast, and it was no mistake. Seeing the commotion among the young people, Nanny said they should stay calm, and Oscar, leaning over the protagonist, said that Xavier was probably joking, so they should go back. Mabel grudgingly wondered if it was possible that the young man was only joking, and then thought that even if it was, she would still be madly interested in seeing this mythical animal. But suddenly, she was shocked to notice something shining in the distance and immediately turned around. Such a reaction on the part of a small child noticed all the others, so they also began to look at what was in the direction where the girl was looking. The protagonist, looking at this fluffy creature, admitted to herself that it did not shine like gold, but it still looked like it was made of precious metal. Mabel stares at the creature in shock, at that moment clearly convinced that she is not dreaming and that she really was able to be reborn in another world. Larimar and Xavier noticed that it seemed as if the mythical beast was reaching out only to Her Highness. But suddenly, the girl unexpectedly sneezed because of what very frightened the little kitten, who thought that they are trying to attack him, so immediately hid in the bushes. And the protagonist, in shock, stretched her hands to him and thought that she didn't want to scare him at all and would like to look at him a little longer. And the excited serpents began to think that the princess had been outside for too long and she was already starting to sneeze, so they should go back. Then the nanny turned to Larimar and Xavier and said that as a punishment for their careless behavior, they should put everything in order. After putting the protagonist in the stroller, Oscar gazed intently into her little face and said that next time they would definitely come here to play so that they could see the mythical beast again. Mabel noticed that when Oscar talked about it, his eyes lit up with anticipation, and perhaps it was because today was the first time she had ever asked for a hug, but she found herself thinking that it didn't annoy her at all, because after all, it wasn't every day that she could see the mythical beast. So she was having fun, and going outside more often wasn't such a bad idea. On the way home, the protagonist was resting quietly in her stroller, and Madame and Oscar were discussing whether the protagonist was sick, because she even sneezed. But Madame explained that everything was fine now because Mabel no longer sneezed and felt fine, but she could have been sick. Then Oscar was thinking that his dear sister might have fallen ill because she had been on the street too long. And Mabel, gazing intently into his face, did not understand what had happened to him and why his reaction had changed so sharply. But suddenly, she realized that the boy was looking in quite another direction. So she turned around excitedly and noticed a man in the distance whom she had never met before. Then, scrutinizing the girl, she noted that she had a piercing look in her green eyes, a tall stature, and an air of inaccessibility about her. And at this moment, Madame stated that before them now was Her Excellency, the Duchess Donovan. Oscars immediately started to hide behind the nanny as if looking for protection, but she tried to explain that she could not help him in any way. At this time, Mabel thought of what she had heard of the Duchess Donovan. Then she realized that this Duchess was the mother of His Highness, the First Prince, and she was called the Duchess of Steel, who was Oscar's own mother. For the Emperor married twice in his lifetime, and the first marriage was of convenience to Pacifica Donovan, but soon after Oscar's birth, they divorced, and after overcoming countless objections, Pacifica became a duchess. And the second time the Emperor married her biological mother, Siana Garginia. People around them said that the couple Esteban Nis Hermano and her mother were literally made for each other, but after giving birth to her mother passed away, and since then it has been a month. At that moment, she was interrupted from her musings by the little prince, who anxiously said that he understood that the Duchess was his mother, but that she frightened him madly. Seeing such a reaction on the part of the child, Mabel thought about the fact that it seemed absolutely incredible that Oscar behaved freely enough in the presence of the Emperor, and yet was so afraid of his mother. After which she admitted that even she was uncomfortable with her presence. She was the child of another woman by her ex-husband, so she was probably an eyesore. And so the protagonist, lying in her wheelchair, mentally asked the Duchess not to look at her with such a piercing gaze and thought that they should get away from this woman as soon as possible. When they left, Oscar and Mabel breathed a sigh of relief that they were finally safe. But suddenly, the girl heard the conversations of unknown people discussing that they should not let the criminal escape because it would be extremely dangerous if he could escape. Then she paid attention to the knights, who were talking furiously and did not understand what was the reason for such anxiety and why Oscar and Madame were so worried. But suddenly, a child who was stopping them with his powerful magic caught my attention. When Mabel saw him, she immediately realized that the knight's reaction must have had something to do with him. The boy seemed harmless, but he could easily handle the well-trained knights without letting them get close to him, and Mabel watched it all, unable to look away. But then suddenly, the blood-red eyes of the little sorcerer looked directly into her blue eyes. The girl, carefully looking at the young magician in front of her, noticed that at the moment when their gazes met, she had a strong feeling, as if there were only the two of them left in this world, and everything in her body was pierced by an insanely strange feeling. At that moment, the madam was approached by an agitated Oscar, who resolutely said that they had to leave here as soon as possible and take the princess away, and she fearfully took hold of the carriage and said that they had to run away. As soon as Mabel left, the boy was clearly worse and bowed his head, so the knight decided to take advantage of this moment to attack and capture him. The protagonist, once safe, was still wondering what had happened, and why they were trying so furiously to overpower this boy, and why Oscar, who keeps looking around, was so tense and had such a worried look on his face. As a result, the Emperor's servant Gustave the Knight reported that the Devil Devlin had stirred because of this was able to break free. When he was being transported to the dungeon, and initially everything was fine, but right in the middle of the Imperial Palace, he spiraled out of control. The young man heard this and thought that such a reaction from Devil Devlin was quite expected, but he didn't understand how it could have happened, and how he could have met Her Highness on her first walk. And even if nothing bad happened, he didn't understand how he could tell the Emperor about it, because as soon as he heard about it, he would undoubtedly be furious, and most likely then his head would fly off his shoulders. But suddenly, to his shock, the knight reported that at the moment of meeting with the princess, for some reason, Devil Devlin lost consciousness. The knight said that he did not know the reason but suspected that maybe it was just an accident and he just exhausted all his magical power. Hearing about this theory, men calmed down a little and then went to the Emperor, who I found calmly minding his own business, and mentally reassured myself that he looked calm enough. Then, catching his cold gaze, he thought that he would like to resign, for he could no longer stand such a nervous job, but nevertheless said that he had come to report on Her Highness. At that moment, the man's face immediately became insanely cold and serious, and he asked what had happened to his daughter, and the man only thought that the Emperor would soon burn a hole in his head with such an expression. After that, he resolutely in one breath reported that during the transportation of the demon Devlin, Her Highness was on a walk, but the Emperor was furious and ordered the guide to report the very essence of his thought as soon as possible. Then he even more anxiously reported that nothing bad had happened, as at that moment they had collided but were at a very great distance. But to his great surprise, he encountered a completely calm and appropriate reaction from Esteban Nisvermano, who said that in this case he had nothing to worry about. The man looked back at the Emperor and, expecting a trick, I don't understand how it could have gone so calmly. After which he joyfully informed with a smile that also on this walk Princess Mabel had seen a mythical beast and also said meow. But in the next moment the Emperor was literally horrified by what he heard and broke his cup, and all his servant could think about was how precious this cup was, which had just shattered into small shards right before his eyes. At the next moment, storm clouds literally gathered over Esteban Nisvermano, and he looked sternly at Gustavo and ordered him to repeat all that he had said then. The young man anxiously reported that Her Highness had encountered Devlin's devil while walking and also said the first word, that was meow. After seeing the emperor's face, Gustavo asked him to control his energy a bit as things were literally starting to break around them because of such a surge. Then mentally hoped that because of such a surge, it was not the pottery that was next to the cup that was crunching now, as it was a national treasure with over 1,000 years of history and had been given to them as a dainty. The next moment, the emperor rose resolutely from his seat and informed his ward that at that very moment he wished to meet Princess Mabel. And Gustavo wondered the reason for this reaction, and whether it was due to the fact that he had not been able to hear his daughter say the first word, and wondered whether meeting a prisoner from another country was not a more serious event for Esteban Nis Hermano. Then Gustavo grudgingly thought about the fact that they had a huge pile of things to do, and that it was so important for Esteban Nis Hermano to hear the first word from his daughter, but realized that if he made such a remark, his foot would never set foot on the ground again. So he just hoped that the emperor could finish his business as soon as possible later. At this time, Mabel was lying unhappily by her bed, complaining that she was insanely hot, for she was well covered, and all the curtains and windows were closed so that she would not catch cold. And all this was because she had only sneezed once on the walk. But she could not cry and protest, for then the nurse would suspect that she was hungry and so on. So she had to keep calm. So things would soon get better since they were in the imperial palace. After that, remembering the young magician, the protagonist thought about who really was that boy with scarlet eyes, which at the moment of their meeting caused such strange feelings inside her. At that moment, Esteban Nis Hermano burst into the room and immediately approached the princess and took her in his arms and asked his daughter how her walk had been. And then he noticed that he thought Mabel had gotten heavier, but the nurse said that the girl had just eaten. Then the emperor looked at the nurse and asked why his daughter was sweating so profusely, but Madame calmly explained that it was a precaution in case Mabel caught cold, so they covered her with his own clothes. Then he turned his gaze to the toy that lay on the floor and turned to Madame and asked her if she had checked it for poison. She was madly surprised and asked the emperor to explain what he meant, but he calmly informed her that she should not neglect even such details. And Mabel thought that as soon as this man came, he began to occupy people with such silly things. So she said, indignantly, that she wanted to go to Madame, but by a great accident she said Mio again, and the emperor looked at his daughter with a worried look, thinking that apparently Gustave had told the truth, and she had really said her first word. She looked at her father's admiring face and thought about the fact that she was just an ordinary child, and the only word she knew was Mio, so he shouldn't admire her so much. After the emperor looked at his daughter excitedly and asked her if she really liked cats that much, and she said Mio again, and then she thought that it didn't matter how many times she repeated it, since her only concept would be meow, so that no one would think she was a genius. Then the emperor stated that apparently the girl really liked cats very much, and with some incomprehensible sadness said that he was sorry that her first word had been about the cat and not about her father. And Mabel wondered unhappily that Oscars had said exactly the same thing. But then Esteban Nis Hermano, excitedly looking at Mabel, said that if she liked cats so much, then in that case the forest in the northern part of the imperial castle, where this cat lives from now on, belongs to her. After that, Esteban Nis Hermano turned to Gustave and asked if he had heard his order. He excitedly took a notebook and said that he had already written everything down and would order to transfer the forest in the northern part of the imperial castle to the ownership of Mabel. The main character was shocked by what she heard and did not believe in the truth of what was happening, because how could it be so frivolous to give her such a huge territory just because she liked cats and she said meow a couple of times? Her father seems insanely thoughtless, like a man who was able to give a whole forest just because his daughter liked to meow and didn't understand the point of giving a forest to a daughter who was only 2 months old, and thought that the emperor was just a crazy person, and so she tried her best to get out of his grip. And the man looked at his daughter thoughtfully and stated that Mabel did not like something, so he turned to Gustave and asked his opinion. The one was quite agitated, pondering the question that the emperor had put to him. And the protagonist, at the sight of the young man, thought that at last there was at least one sensible person who would inform the emperor that he was wrong. But then Gustave thought that the landscape of the northern forest was not so beautiful, so it was no match for the residence of the imperial family built along the forest. Esteban Nis Hermano smiled happily when he heard this and told his assistant that he was absolutely right, while Mabel was shocked and didn't understand what Gustave was talking about, because how could a child of 2 months old even know what a landscape was? At that moment, the emperor announced that he was ready to give his order. Then, gazing at his favorite daughter, he said that he wanted to give her the castle of Ponce, but then smiled at the little girl and told her not to worry, as the northern forest would remain in her domain as well. The protagonist smiled reassuringly and then convinced herself that, as expected, her father was indeed insane. But time went on, and it's been 3 months since Mabel was born. So on this day, the kingdom of Hermano will be visited by important guests, namely the priests of the Holy Kingdom of Abelardo, who is the representative of the god for which they are honored everywhere. The chief of the visitors smiled happily and greeted His Majesty Emperor Hermano, but he was clearly not happy to see them. And he thought about the fact that the temple lowlifes had dared to come to him after all, and he thought that he wished madly that he could chop those damn holy men into sawdust and use them for firewood, thinking about the fact that he had not expected to see them so soon. But then the man smilingly inquired, "Is His Majesty so surprised at their sudden visit, and therefore looking so menacing?" But he smiled grudgingly and tried to hide his anger and said that he was really surprised, because earlier he had heard that they had come to exchange ancient holy writings. Then he advised them to go and study everything properly and thought that these people should get out of his sight as soon as possible. But the priest of the holy nation smiled and thanked Esteban Nis Hermano for his concern and then assured him that the results of their research would be of great benefit to both Abelardo and Hermano. But first he had something to say about His Highness Princess Mabel Winter Gardenia Hermano. The emperor looked at this insolent priest of the holy nation with all sternness and corrected him and informed him that his daughter's name was Mabel Gardenia Hermano, and he should correct himself and not make such mistakes in the future. Then Gustavus, who was observing it all, thought that Winter was a divine name from prophecy. And at the same time that the princess was born, the Holy Kingdom officially announced that Her Highness' middle name was Winter. But Esteban Nis Hermano was definitely against it, so he gave the priest of the holy nation a determined look and said that in their kingdom they do not recognize the oracle of Abelardo. So the priest of the holy nation could not be sure that the oracle's prediction was about his daughter. Esteban Nis Hermano clutched the armrest of his throne and thought about the fact that their empire was in the easternmost part of the continent. And when Mabel was born, lightning had struck in the middle of a clear sky, but it could still have been a coincidence. And so the prophecy that a seed had been planted on the outskirts of the east that would save the world might not apply to her at all. But the priest of the holy nation only informed with a sly smile that he had expected such a statement from His Majesty. The knight and also Gustavus were watching all this, thinking that after the marriage it seemed to them that the emperor's temper had softened and they were probably mistaken and he would return to his former self. But the emperor, with all the determination of a magical energy, said that Mabel was a baby that had just been born, and the priest of the holy nation insinuated that she was so small and weak that she should be sent to the holy realm just because of some dubious oracle. But the man calmly began digging into the pocket of his robes and said that he wanted to show him an object that the holy king had given to His Majesty the emperor. The emperor looked at the thing and wondered if his daughter really needed it, and if it would make her feel better. But afterwards he resolutely clutched the thing in his hand and said that his daughter would be better off with him. Then he said that the king of the Holy Kingdom, Abelardo, had decided to give him the pendant of the previous emperor. Then he remembered that when the previous emperor had fought for the throne, he had received help from the Holy Kingdom and had left them this pendant as proof. Then Esteban Nis Hermano looked at the priests of the holy nation with all the determination and anger he could muster and asked if their king had decided that they would accept the fact that the current emperor, Esteban Nis Hermano, would have to pay for the debts of the already deceased emperor with his own child. To this the priest of the holy nation reacted with perfect calmness, saying that Esteban Nis Hermano himself understood what such a message from their king could mean. But he scrutinized his insolent face and stated that the priest of the holy nation had not heard what he was trying to say and asked, Does he look like a man who would sell his own child? But the one looked closely at Esteban Nis Hermano and said that the Holy King only wants to protect the one the oracle pointed out. And they know that they can't take the princess right now, as that wouldn't be wise. At this time, the disgruntled emperor remarked that their king had not gone mad after all until the very end. But in any case, these sacred nation scoundrels were unpleasant to him. Then scrutinizing Esteban Nis Hermano, the priest of the sacred nation, said that since this time His Majesty had confidently refused them, they were ready to withdraw. But in return, they had a small request and would like to ask for an audience with Her Highness the Princess. Looking into the priest's insolent face, the emperor immediately realized that this was his real goal, and even if he wanted to refuse, the deal between the past emperor and the Holy King had already been mentioned. So they put the emperor in a situation where he had no choice. So he accepted his terms and offered his own. To the shock of the clergy, Esteban Nis Hermano's conditions were that the audience would be held in his presence, and that all priests of the holy nation must keep at least 20 meters away from Mabel, and it was forbidden to touch her, and naturally the use of divine and magical power was forbidden, and that if Mabel began to cry, the audience would be immediately terminated. After listening to all this, the priest of the holy nation thought that Esteban Nis Hermano must have gone completely mad and did not understand why this grown man was behaving so childishly. But Esteban Nis Hermano himself only thought that if these Abelardo clerics were a threat to his daughter, he could always be there to protect her. At this time, the protagonist tiredly opened her eyes after sleep and found that the surroundings were rather unusually quiet and could not understand what it was connected with. Then she looked around the room and found Larimar and her nanny doing their usual things, and then Mabel realized that Xavier must not be with them. And that's why it was so quiet. Lying in her bed, the girl stated that her nanny and maid were busy, so she should secretly practice turning over, and because she was already lying on her side, it would be much easier. So she began her attempts, assuring herself that she would succeed today. But even after a couple of minutes, she still hadn't moved, and she was terrified, not understanding why her head felt so heavy. And then sadly realized that she should stop her training now, because if she sweats like last time, everyone will make a fuss again, so she should try it again when she's alone. But suddenly, Oscar burst into the room, saying hello to Mabel and asking if she was expecting him. But the protagonist decided that she would not even answer him, because it's been 3 months and Oscar still comes even without receiving any response from her, and the protagonist hoped that by this time the boy will be tired and will stop coming to her. But he did not do it because of what the protagonist thought he was insanely strange. Then the child sitting closer to her joyfully began to open the book and told the girl that he wanted to read a little. She, carefully looking at Oscar, wondered what he wanted to read, and was convinced that most likely he brought an insanely boring book. But then she discovered that the cover of the book he brought absolutely does not look childish, but still decided to wait until Oscar will start reading. To her surprise, he began to read a book on Chekhov's discourse on the evils of the doctrine of Bourdism. The protagonist, awkwardly listening to all this, did not understand why the boy brought her such a serious book to read, since she was now in the body of a 3-month-old baby. But Oscar resolutely continued reading the book, which said that Chekhov's views were well received by the scientists of the time, but questions began to appear in later eras. The protagonist awkwardly looked around at her brother, not believing that he was really 6 years old, then wondered, does all 6-year-olds in this world have to read something like this? After that, he continued his reading and then found a strange expression on the protagonist's face and excitedly realized that she wasn't interested, although earlier he had thought it might interest her. Seeing Oscar's worried face, she wondered how a 3-month-old child could be interested in Chekhov's discussion of doctrinal harm, and she had no idea what her brother was thinking at the time of choosing the book. But the next moment he leaned over her bed and smiled brightly and promised her that next time he would bring a more interesting book. But she wondered how a prince of 6 could be forced to read such things. Then she realized that all evil comes from the idea of early education of the emperor. But suddenly, there was a sharp sound of footsteps behind the door, and the protagonist herself, without realizing it again, said "Meo," and then admitted to herself that it came out completely by accident, but she still did not understand what that noise was. At that moment, Oscara, also the nanny who had been knitting quietly before, rose abruptly from her seat, and then Mabel realized that the atmosphere was different from when the emperor usually came, and hence the situation was different now. When the doors opened, the nanny and Oscar greeted His Majesty Esteban Nis Hermano, and then the girl looked at the clergymen who literally shone in their white robes, and fretted that she was being haunted by some vague bad feeling inside, as if my whole body was crying out for danger. The next moment, the chief priest of the holy nation smiled happily and stated that the person in front of them was Her Highness the Princess. Mabel was madly surprised at this statement and thought that perhaps the man could see her true form. Then the priest of the holy nation put his hand to his heart and smiled happily and reported that Mabel was insanely healthy and also overflowing with holy power. But the girl shrank back in horror and realized that the closer this man came, the more nauseous she began to feel. But fortunately, he was stopped by the emperor, who said they had a condition that he should not approach. The priest of the holy nation smiled and said that he remembered the condition perfectly, but he could not contain his delight when the protagonist of the oracle's prophecy stood before him. Esteban Nis Hermano looked him over coldly and told him that in their empire they didn't think the oracle was talking about Mabel, to which the priestess of the holy nation only replied that it was impossible to say for sure yet. After all, the girl had not awakened, but Her Highness possesses boundless divine power. The protagonist, listening to all this, she didn't understand what they were talking about. She was sure that these people were talking about her, but she couldn't catch the gist of the conversation because she was getting worse. And it was all because of one man who was scrutinizing her. Then the protagonist thought that maybe the feeling that overwhelms her is a divine power. At that moment, Oscar leaned over to her, who saw that his sister was not feeling well and thought that she was frightened. So he tried to comfort her and be there for her so that she could feel at least someone familiar close to her. Then he explained to her that these were the priests from Abelardo. The next moment, the emperor stood up resolutely without letting them get any closer to the protagonist and informed them that the clerics had come for an audience to meet Mabel, and they had. The priest of the holy nation agreed and then said that he had heard earlier that the Hermano Empire was holding Devlin hostage, and asked how long he had been in their possession. Esteban Nis Hermano calmly reported that the boy has been with them for about a month. But the priest of the holy nation calmly said that the demon Devlin is a very talented man that can use aura without intermediaries, and asked if there were any casualties. On what Esteban Nis Hermano calmly reported that there were quite a few wounded, as it is quite difficult to contain him even with a device to control the magical power. The protagonist immediately remembered this boy and realized that she had previously thought it was just a funny nickname, but judging by the emperor's words, this boy is very strong. Then, to the emperor's great surprise, the priest of the holy nation reported that the Devlin Empire's actions lately are very disturbing, as they are already stretching out their hands even to the holy realm, and they are clearly up to something. Then, looking carefully at Esteban Nis Hermano, the priest of the holy nation said that if it came to the return of the hostage, it could affect the Hermano Empire. So Esteban Nis Hermano should be careful. And then all the priests of the holy nation bowed and smiled and said they would be glad to see Her Highness Princess Mabel Winter Gardenia Hermano next time.